Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I think it's fair to say that professional services organizations have always been very metrics driven, but there is a certain sense of urgency at the moment with the economy the way it is, and I think everybody is just super fixated on how do we establish goals for these metrics, what's the implication on profitability and revenue with these metrics. And I suspect for our team doing benchmarks, it's going to be a very, very busy year. I'm thrilled to have Uriah with me. He's a practitioner, he's in the trenches. So we're going to be diving into some discussions and hope I can provide the numbers, but Uriah, it's going to be up to you to provide all the best practices. So, the topic is this delicate balance between quantitative and qualitative measures. And one of the things that became very clear to me pulling together slides for this webinar is professional services is really heavy on the quantitative side and a little bit light on the qualitative side. At least from the data we have. So anxious to really dive into some of these numbers, get some best practices. Maybe there's some qualitative numbers I don't know about that you can shed some light on. So let's dive into really looking at the quantitative metrics for professional services. And I'm highlighting three areas that I know anytime we publish a report with these metrics in the title or a blog, they're typically jump to the top read. So my take is these are three of the most critical metrics for professional services. So project delivery margins, I've got the industry average and then the pace setter average. So those are like the top third of all companies and what their averages are. Some pretty significant differences on most of these between industry average and pace setter. Billable utilization rate, 58%, pace setter 72, which is pretty amazing that your folks are spending their time delivering revenue and not sitting on the bench or doing internal training or whatever. And rate realization, are we billing our people out for the price we intend to? And I think this is important for obviously revenue, but as a consultant, you don't want to feel like you're on blue light special. So it's not a great feeling when you've got all these skills and experience and you're being billed out at a low rate. It's not it's not great for employee satisfaction either. So Uriah, you are the VP of Global Advisory Services for Kantata. You've been on multiple webinars, so welcome back. Thanks for joining me today.
Hey, yeah, thanks, John. Nice to be here with you again. Yeah, there's a lot to dig into here, to your point. I kind of maybe will tackle each of these with a little bit of a different point of view on them, because just thinking of the first one and gross margins as a whole, obviously, I think to your point, everyone's focused on that now, right? Like maybe at the expense of even, the realized rate, which obviously is going to factor into that, and utilization, I suppose, could also just be a way of calculating a margin depending on how you run your business. But, certainly from the companies that we're talking to as of late, like that's where the focus is, right? Everybody needs to show profitability and increasing that metric probably above all others, not only in running their own business, but certainly in just, who they talk to with their customers, improving the value of what they do and so on, right? So we went back and thought about this from, the lens of the companies that we talked to. And it's interesting, a couple of things kind of popped out. I guess one is, the margins that we're talking about here, like some companies would die to even have a 34% gross margin. Like we talked to plenty of companies that are barely break even, maybe even accepting that some of those things are going to be loss leaders for other metrics, that maybe some of the qualitative ones that we'll talk about next around CSAT and the like, but and certainly a pretty marked difference there too between embedded services companies versus those that are more in the pure consulting realm. I guess in terms of the best practices around it, one big one to me that's quite obvious is that a lot of companies project margins when they sell, right? So there's a lot of companies would have a business of, hey, before I even sell this deal, we're targeting whatever, right? It's going to be a 40% gross margin and that's what we're selling it based on, but this resource mix and all of these assumptions around how we're actually going to deliver the work. And then you get into delivery, and to be honest, most times that mix isn't really what you end up staffing the project with. So, and then it's like, oh, shoot, I expected to have this low cost resource and this part was going to be fixed price or whatever the blend is going to be. Very rarely is there that connection between the two, right? So I guess the point there being, very few companies really think about the linkage between, okay, this is what we're estimating and quoting. Then all of a sudden, once we actually get to fulfilling that, then there's sort of a break point there. It's really hard to make up that difference, right? I mean, if you're scrambling around and finding resources later and trying to plug in the gaps, I mean, you've already lost sort of half the battle there and trying to get back to the margins you're expecting. So I think that's one, and maybe I'll ask John if you have any commentary on that before I kind of talk a little bit further on the next part. But
well, the one point that I always try to make when I'm sharing numbers like this, if you're in the audience and you're panicking because your numbers are much different, these are industry averages. So these are averages from hardware companies, software companies, on-premise companies, cloud companies, all over, global, different sizes, different industries. So when you benchmark with us, we actually do a peer group to show you companies exactly like you, this is what your number would be. So obviously, like you gave the example between an enterprise software company and a pure services consulting company, the numbers are very, very different. So I think these are good back of the envelope numbers that are industry averages, but yeah, don't panic if your number's way off.
Of course.
Or maybe you should panic. I don't know.
Maybe you should panic anyways. It's something to aspire to, I suppose. But I think that's a big point, that it may be just more of a mindset shift too, is that, most of us, when we're thinking of PS and the world that we can control, if you will, obviously our focus on margin needs to be at a delivery level, right? We want to, limit revenue leakage and kind of control our project once we're running it. But I think that the point I would make there is there's a big battle to be fought when you're kind of selling and positioning your services up front, where, if you don't do that right, or if you have no visibility into that process, or, if all of a sudden your sales team is discounting your rates 20% before you even start, same point, it's going to be really hard for you to make up the difference in margin no matter what you do. So, I guess, the companies that really kind of drive themselves more towards that pace setter average or even above that, I'd say they require, or at least demand, kind of visibility to that whole end-to-end cycle of how the work is being sold up front. Otherwise, you really can only control like half the picture. So the utilization one, that's an interesting one too, because to your point from a minute ago, John, like we'll talk to a company and they might be pushing 95% utilization for their delivery staff and say, God, 72% even seems low. But same point, I think your results kind of vary based on your peer group there. I think a big difference that I would articulate, and maybe around the best practice part of that, we've talked in previous sessions around this kind of pivot towards more outcomes or, specific packaged offerings. Obviously those are built with the idea that you're going to have more certainty. You're probably going to be much more precise in how those are being delivered. And certainly that's going to help your team kind of spend their time on more pure billable activities, as opposed to spending a lot of time on, everything being a one-off and something custom and so on. So yeah, I think that's another big one there. The other part of it, I guess, inherently is utilization, of course, only kind of really matters if you're doing T&M. So, we were just talking about this right before we started, but I see a lot of companies that do mostly fixed price work and their utilization rates are through the roof, but then you go look at the margin or the realized rate and realize it's like terrible. So maybe the other point there would be, some companies I know have a tendency to just focus on maybe one of these, but you really kind of can't do that. They all play off each other, and you might be sacrificing your profitability on a project for the sake of utilization or vice versa. So just keep in mind that all of them have to kind of come together.
So are you seeing more focus on these numbers? Because I think that executives have always been obviously, tracking all of these, but I'm hearing that even, consultants are being made much more understanding of what the numbers are, what their expectations are to hit. So it just kind of more manic than usual.
It is. I mean, there's definitely still the level of personal accountability. Like if I'm a delivery resource, I know what my charter is, which is generally to do billable utilized work, right? Obviously, an individual's influence over their ability to do that may depend, and we're actually going to talk about that a little bit in a couple slides in terms of some of the things that people might be able to do to help influence or get themselves in a place to, deliver on some of these metrics. But yeah, I mean, to your point, like there's definitely a heightened focus on the quantitative, even more so now than ever, for sure.
So just before we move from this, I said these are, I think, three of the most critical, really financial metrics. Are there other, metrics that you think everybody should have in their like top 5 to keep an eye on?
I guess it depends on your focus, right? If you're in delivery, well, I guess we'll talk about the qualitative ones a little bit later, but there's I'd say subset components of this. Like you can obviously slice utilization 100 different ways. You can think about margin and maybe the related ones like revenue leakage is maybe a good example, right? Like a lot of companies actually measure that as its own standalone metric nowadays. Is it really different from margin? I mean, not necessarily, right? I mean, it's sort of adjacent to it or could contribute to it, but back to, I think the point I was thinking about before on that though is that's something that presumably a delivery team has full control over, right? Whereas margin as a whole has influence from other parts of the organization. So it really just depends on the sphere of control of, who the delivery team, or sorry, what the delivery team actually has ownership over. One last tangible example there, and I always find this interesting. Some say delivery organizations or like project management teams or whatnot, some do have financial ownership over their projects. So like, I as a project manager have responsibility for not only delivery, right, and delivery health and all of those things, but I also have the financial component to it. Like I have to deliver my project at 25% margin. Some companies don't do it that way, right? They consciously separate it and say, no, your focus is only on the non-financial delivery and the financial ownership is more, P&L level or something else. So that split is always an interesting one. And I can appreciate kind of both sides of why you might incent people accordingly. But, as you would expect, people are going to drive the results that they're measured on. So if you have a PM that's not focused on margin and only on CSAT, guess what? Their margins are probably going to take a hit because they're going to be focused more on the things that are important to them. So that comes into play too, I guess, is kind of an interesting dynamic.
Yeah, incentives are interesting. I got cornered by a member in Vegas who was very upset because they had a personal MBO around utilization rate, and yet they had absolutely no input in how they were scheduled. So, they're being dinged because their number's not up and they didn't feel there was anything within their control to influence it. And I think that's a good kind of foray to the next kind of set of metrics I wanted to touch on is all of these employee related metrics, because obviously PS is a very people-centric business. And I've got a couple of numbers here. 83% have an employee engagement program. I would advise you, if you haven't revisited your employee engagement program since before COVID, you probably need to overhaul it, because a lot of the employee engagement programs were originally built for in-person access to executives and one-on-ones with the VP and personal mentoring programs, and a lot of it may not be as applicable. 59% have a talent management program. I've got some elements here around talent management. Some other employee numbers. Voluntary attrition rate is averaging 8.3%, just the voluntary attrition, which is pretty high. Pacesetters at a 2%. But at the upper end, we're routinely seeing 10 to 12% just voluntary attrition. So, I don't know if that's part of the whole Great Resignation thing. And the one other thing I'll mention, I just was reading an article in New York Times. They mentioned a Gallup poll that found that companies with disengaged employees had 16% lower profitability, 18% lower productivity, and 37% lower job growth. So, there are a lot of financial implications when your employees are not happy.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in there, right? I mean, I'll talk in a minute on the next slide about some of the ways that we've seen where companies can really help their employees improve that level of engagement. But just before we get to that, in terms of your point, like it's being a people business, and we've all kind of been there. For those of us that have lived this life before, there's obviously an expectation that your primary focus is always going to be on doing customer work, and I think that's kind of relatively well known. But the how supported you feel and how much of the kind of organizational support to bring you on that journey varies wildly, right? And I think that kind of is what you see in your numbers here. I don't think any consultant anywhere would ever say, gee, I had no idea I was supposed to be billable on projects. So, but to your point, how much are they supporting, that? Like, do I feel like the company cares in so many words, or am I just kind of here as a number and a resource, and I'm just expected to do this and, not ask questions and not have the ability to grow and further my career? Obviously, no one's going to want to be in that sort of situation when they don't feel like they have the support to grow into new skills, to make themselves available, to further their career, right? I mean, obviously everyone has their own aspirations for those things, but I think it's interesting to me, like, so even your two numbers here, yes, almost every company has like a sort of HR driven employee measurement, employee engagement sort of process. And that's good for a company as a whole. But, I think within PS, because of the sort of unique expectations of those jobs, you do kind of need to have a different lens to it, right? Like, it's not as much about, do you have a function here? Or do you have a purpose? Because again, that part is pretty clear, I think, for what those roles are. But how am I supported to know that I'm going to be able to continue working? Or I think the one that stands out to me here is like the coaching, the succession planning, like how do I make myself better, right? And hopefully the how do I make myself better is not because I need to go work for a new company, because that's not good for any of us, right? So, maybe that's a good way to kind of go to the next here, which I kind of talk to a couple of specific examples around that. One is, so we see this a lot, like, and I think it ties to your example that you gave around the person saying, like, I don't, I measured on utilization, I have no control over it. Like, what do I do? Because I'm just at the mercy of my resourcing team to put me on the right projects. Well, couple things to think about there, right? I mean, one is if you have the ability to do it, say technology-wise, some companies do actually give their employees visibility to what I would call those aspirational projects. So, I might be working on, whatever, right? The couple projects that I'm working on, but hey, I see out there that there's 20 other projects that require these skills or that these other people are working on. Like, how do I sort of, well, one, even know, right? Because I'm so busy in my day-to-day working on my projects, like I'm not out there like looking at job boards and looking at other stuff. But if I know that all these other people are doing this kind of work, and maybe that'll spark the idea in your head to say, maybe I should start to set myself up to be able to take on some of those projects instead. So, there's ways you can enable that, but I think the visibility of what am I not doing that I could potentially be doing feels like a very important one as a way for, me as an individual to feel like there is a path and there is a possibility for me to do more. The next one there, and kind of related to that, again, everybody has their own idea of what career progression means to themselves. Some people obviously want to advance through the ranks and, become managers and become whatever. Some people are perfectly happy just kind of doing their thing and being consultants and working on their projects. But, even in that scenario, skills change, the projects you work on change, that sort of management of skills and the skill development and how that relates to the projects that are out there. It's somewhat back to the first point. If I see that there's all this work in this area, but I don't have the skills for that, hey, that's an identified need to go talk to your manager and say, how do I develop myself here, right? Like, how do I work on these skills? And I feel like there's a little bit of a kind of disconnect there too, right? From a technology standpoint, there's obviously plenty of skills management and, skill tracking functionality. Those are kind of a little bit sometimes separated from the actual project work themselves. So yes, there's a way to intermix the two, but, it doesn't, the fact that I have these 10 technical skills in a vacuum doesn't really matter if the project work requires these other 10 skills that I don't have. So point to take away from that is, skills development on its own doesn't stand alone from the actual needs of the business and where those skills are applicable. And, putting those two together and doing that sort of analysis, like, these are the skills that we're short on, and this is where we should hire or develop the people we have. That level of sort of putting the two together, I feel like doesn't happen enough. And, sometimes the tendency is just, oh, I need somebody who does this, I'm just going to go hire them. Well, you know what? We all know the cost of hiring and whatever is somewhat prohibitive these days. Maybe you should think about, retraining the people you have to take on those skills instead. But unless you identify the fact that that gap is even there, it's just sort of a binary decision, right? Like, I need the skill, I'm going to go hire. And that's not necessarily always the right answer. And then the last one, kind of furthering on that point, and John, I know you like to kind of touch on this one a lot around the gig economy, but, the answer may still be to go get people that aren't in your organization, right? So a lot of people, again, over the last few years have maybe taken the opportunity to become those specialists. And in that case, to be fair, skill development maybe doesn't matter because they have their specialized skill and they're going to be the expert in that, and they're going to make themselves available to all the other companies out there that require that kind of work. It's kind of the inverse of the example we just talked about, but that's fine. As an individual, that can be their choice. But then how, as a company, do I know where those people are, right? How do I find them? How do I go out there to that broader pool of talent that's out there kind of in the ecosystem, if you will, and, make those people available maybe just for a project, right? I don't want to invest in them long term, but maybe they don't want that either. But, plugging in those gaps where, because all the skill development and the cross training and all the things we've talked about obviously don't happen overnight. So this could be a good way to sort of plug the gap in the middle while you wait for people to get themselves to a level where they can be capable. So a lot there, but I'd love your perspective on some of that too, John.
Well, we've done webinars before on gig economy, and I know Kantata has some good survey data showing particularly younger PS workers really like that approach to work. They don't want to be stuck at one company. If you're really ambitious, you want to earn money, you can work 18 hours a day for a couple of different companies, couple of different projects. And if that's the way employees want to work, we've got to get better at doing it. And, my view is that's going to become one of the predominant approaches to staffing in the future. And if you haven't got a strategy for leveraging that today for a small percentage of projects when you need to scale up or scale down quickly, you need to figure it out now. Because as the baby boomers and the Gen Zs start aging out of the workforce, the new people coming up they're just not going to stick with you for 5 years. It's just That's just not the way it's gonna work.
Yeah, it's definitely a mix, right? I mean, I guess in the perfect world, you have a mix of these sort of gig economy, freelancers, if you will, and then you obviously still want to make sure you develop or provide the career opportunities there for your own team. So, I'll let you. Well,
I know I'm kind of speaking the obvious here, but one last point on employee engagement. I am hearing very few, but I'm hearing a few, snarky executive comments about, well, with the economy the way it is and layoffs happening, employees are happy to have a job, so employee engagement's not that important. Well, there have been a lot of layoffs, but nobody's laying off consultants. And consultants with good skills are always in high demand and can easily jump to a competitor or an industry-specific role. So I think particularly for professional services, this is something that you can never start, taking or just assuming or taking not enough notice on, because you're going to end up in a bad situation with customer backlog if your employees start bailing because you're ignoring engagement. So,
for sure.
Okay. So moving to qualitative, and as I said up front, there's a lot of financial numbers, but when we get into qualitative measurements for professional services, I didn't find a lot. From our benchmark. If you look at an area like technical support or field service or customer success, they got tons of, really qualitative customer satisfaction and customer effort scores and net promoter scores. But we don't seem as heavy on that on PS. So the two numbers that I did find, which are a little troubling, and maybe you can shed some light on these for me. So 70% of companies have a CSAT measurement progress or program or process in place, but only 26% of engagements are receiving a SAT score. Mm-hmm. So is that because they're gathering enough information through the execution of the project, or does that
like
number
to say,
concern you?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple thoughts come to mind there. I mean, one, to your first number, I think you're right. There's a lot of CSAT, NPS, methodologies out there. I appreciate there's technology that's specifically dedicated to that. And I think over the last few years, a lot of that has maybe shifted out of even PS's hands more to customer success, or those other adjacent groups when they exist within an organization. At least, obviously, if it's a company where that doesn't exist, like those still stay in PS. But I think the focus is actually narrowed a bit, where it's more of a, not like a customer level CSAT, but maybe more think of it as like the qualitative, like I'm a project manager and this is the health of my project. And that's what a lot of companies actually think of it as, which is obviously not the same as, the traditional kind of CSAT measurement as a whole. It's more like with a project tip to it. And I think that is what leads into the next one, which is in a way then, the idea of doing project postmortems or project wrap-ups or all of those things, I mean, obviously are nothing new. Like companies have been doing those for as long as they've been doing projects. But to the point here, it certainly doesn't happen enough. And I think part of that is maybe exacerbated a bit by the fact that, the project teams themselves don't necessarily persist. Like if you're not going to work with the same people again, companies maybe just sort of are like, well, I could do the postmortem, but it doesn't really matter because, we know we went live and we accomplished these things. And guess what? Like the customer temperature, if you will, is where we ended the project. So we don't need to go through a whole other exercise to kind of measure something again. I'm not saying that's the right answer, obviously, but I do think that's what we're seeing in a lot of this. I think part of it there that's really, I guess, kind of a big gap to me is, twofold. I guess one is, certainly it's still your customer. Like you still want to understand like where they are from a qualitative standpoint. That measurement may just be done elsewhere, like no longer at the project level. That's where I think it goes back then to, hey, the CSM is talking to the customer and I think they're, happy. So, the measurement just moves somewhere else, I guess, is part of it. I think the opportunity there, though, is kind of twofold. I mean, one is, to me, the purpose of doing a project postmortem is not necessarily just because you're concerned whether your customer is happy. You have plenty of ways to figure that out. But it's really, how do you improve yourself, right? How do you improve like your own services business? So, what you should hopefully be doing is, how did my consultants do? Like, did they perform as I expected? How do I set them up for success on the next project that they go to? Think about it through a financial lens. Like, we ended with, and it's the tie back to the quantitative, but to me, the postmortem should be, we anticipated, for my example earlier, 40% margin, we delivered at 29. Hey, let's figure out where that 11% went. So the next time we go through the process, like we don't make those same mistakes again, or whatever, right? Not to say they're mistakes, but how we don't repeat history and end up, losing profitability along the way. That stuff is,
especially on fixed price repeatable projects, where you're going to be doing that same project over and over again.
But so I think that's maybe the mindset shift that some companies have embraced, which is, the point of the postmortem is not just to think about the project and grill the project manager, like, what did you do wrong on this project? It's more to make the collective end-to-end process better. And I don't think a lot of companies think about the whole cycle, because really, like I said, that feedback should go back to your estimation process and even your sales process, and then to the staffing team, so they understand, like, maybe we didn't put the right people on this project. Like, embracing that sort of whole end-to-end view of it. I mean, that's really the sort of nirvana of it. But obviously, that takes a lot of work and a lot of kind of cross-functional commitment from an organization to make that happen. So,
what are your thoughts on DSO as a qualitative measurement? I just wrote a blog about this and said, if you've got really high DSO for PS, you need to dig into and it could be billing issues, it could be a lot of things, but
Yeah.
in general, I think DSO does reflect satisfaction with the work performed.
It does. I mean, it's a very interesting question. I mean, sometimes you have, poor DSO numbers just because your customer's finance team is really good and is paying you as late as they possibly can, and you have no control over it, to be fair, right? That may or may not be a perspective on the delivery of your work. But, to your point, in reality, that there probably is a lot there, right? I mean, having delivery issues or, having, I guess, tactically, right? Well, I disagree that, you delivered this work and then there's dispute over payment and we're giving non-billable hours and all those sorts of things, all that, like real actual stuff that happens on many projects, as we're all aware. Like, I 100% agree that that would factor into DSO in a way, because until you sort of work through and resolve those things, that's when, I'm not going to pay you until we get to this next milestone, even though I know we said we were going to pay in the schedule, stuff like that. Like, that's absolutely a thing that happens. And probably, I would guess again, everyone's trying to stretch their money a little bit further these days. So I would only expect the DSO numbers to go up probably pretty significantly.
Yeah, it could be. And I had a question from Melissa. DSO is days sales outstanding. So how many days does it take a customer to pay a bill? And a lot of indicators there, but definitely some SAT. To close out on this, I do think that even if PS hasn't been incredibly focused on the customer experience, that is definitely changing. More than half of companies who completed a customer journey mapping exercise, professional services, 69% of the time is involved in that. So, with more chief customer officers out there and really trying to understand the end-to-end customer experience, I think the role that PS plays and maybe how they could better contribute to the experience is something that we're going to find out through this journey mapping. So I'm hoping as part of that 26% number is going to improve. So the final.
Sorry, just one quick thing on that before you go on. I was just going to say, like, I mean, it's pretty obvious that we would all like all those numbers to be 100%, right? Like, I'd find it hard to believe that anyone would really believe it's a true customer journey if you aren't encompassing kind of all parts of your company that ultimately contribute to your customer. But just on the PS part, I mean, a lot of the companies that we work with, and even ourselves, because we've actually gone through this journey over the past couple of years, I mean, ultimately, your delivery team is really kind of driving what those outcomes and what those, the pieces that face your customer, like, ultimately should originate with PS. Like, they should be at 100%. It's almost getting the other parts of the organization on board that's kind of the gap there. And, I just feel like it's missing an opportunity to, again, not think about the fact that how you sell and how you deliver and how your product functions in the case of a product company, like, it has to all tie together. Otherwise, it's not really a true customer journey. So.
Well, I think the most troubling number on that slide was only 7% of companies are including the customer in customer journey mapping, and that's kind of an issue too. Building an experience in a vacuum is always the way to go. So we had alluded in our abstract about automating quote to cash, and certainly if it's taking forever to deliver a proposal, if it's taking forever for the customer to sign it because they've got a lot of questions and the proposal's got a lot of holes in it, if it's taking you forever to source the consultants to get a project started once the customer signed the deal, this quote to cash can stretch out a lot. So I do think that that's a critical metric when we're trying to get our dollars in. We want to be recognizing the revenue. We don't want deals stretching into the next year. And this obviously is something that professional services automation is really, a huge contributor to accelerating all of this. So could you talk a little bit about why speeding up quote to cash is important?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you almost kind of set the stage for it there a couple of minutes ago, but, certainly at the end of the day, being a people business and driving billable work, like, you need to get that money back into the door of your company, right? And all these steps along the way and kind of treating them as independent silos that ultimately kind of, because to be fair, in a lot of organizations, there's different groups that perform these different functions, right? You might have a different team doing sort of the quoting or the services sales, if you will, the The operational process along with that might be something disconnected. The staffing part, again, is obviously a different team, but to your point, I mean, if you look at that number, so 21 weeks from the time that you start a sales process to when you actually even begin a project, that's not even tacking on the time it actually takes to finish the work, right? And back to our point from before, you may not actually have cash in the door until even later on in that, depending on how you sort of structure your billing. So, everybody wants to come to the point where your work and your payments and your cash flow is loosely correlated to the time you're doing your work, right? But it's very heavily like backloaded if you think about it. You're doing all this work basically up front, not getting any money for it. Even when you're in delivery, in a lot of cases, those things are going to be towards the end. So, there's a lot of inherent risk there, right? I mean, never mind like the payment issues and those sorts of things, but, there's a better way to do it. And to your point, to kind of bring this number down significantly. Not only that, but there's all the supplemental benefits to it, right? If you deliver your projects faster, if you staff your projects faster, those on their own are competitive advantages, right? Like you're competing for a piece of consulting work with another vendor and they say, I can have a project team there, in a week and we can get started. And your answer is, sorry, it's going to take me, 18 weeks before we can start, and all other things are equal. Guess who's probably going to win that work? It's not you, right? So
absolutely.
There's a lot of other things there beyond just the cash part that have to come into.
You also have to keep in mind, I mean, I know that this is primarily around implementation, integration, consulting work, but as PS shifts more toward a charter of adoption and value and starts doing more value-added projects, monetize customer success projects, subscription, renewable services, all of that's got to be a self-service model. They pick from a service catalog, they pick what they want, it automatically gives them a contract, the PO is paid for online, and within an hour, they've got a start date for the consultant. So I know you can't really do that on a big project today, but you got to start working in that direction because you're going to have a really difficult time if you're doing all of this manually and suddenly you're doing much more succinct projects, because this is not a scalable model for that.
Yeah, no, for sure. Maybe that's a good transition to what is one possible way you might be able to solve some of those problems, right? So, hey, that's why we're here. But in all seriousness, I mean, there are definitely components to that tie together the technology with the business process that goes along with it. So, the big part that I would always talk about with this is, we're providing technology, not because the technology is making the answers for you, like as much as we were joking about the fact that maybe in a couple of years, like, maybe all PSA software will be replaced by ChatGPT and we'll just have everybody will kind of automate our jobs. But until that point, people still need to make decisions. How do you get the data and the right data to make those decisions in a timely manner? That's a big part of what we're talking about, right? Like ultimately humans still need to make decisions based on something that's there and tangible, and not having those inputs or that data is a big source of, why these things take so long, back to our previous slide of as far as why these cycles take so long. The best practices part, I mean, that's a lot of what we've talked about today, but again, the decisions are one thing, delivering and executing on those decisions is another, and making sure you still run your projects successfully, making sure, you tighten up all the other loose ends that are there. Those are all still, important in running a service business today. And I guess the last part of it is really just, now that you've done that and maybe you've kind of tightened up your sales process, you've made better data-driven decisions up front, you're taking decisive action and that's fine, but how do you do that feedback loop that we talked about a few minutes ago, right? How do you take what you learned from this delivery, put it back into the whole process and make yourself better? It's the whole idea of continuous improvement, but that is, again, probably more important now than ever, especially if you look at the metrics that you've been sharing throughout this presentation. I mean, a lot of this stuff isn't new. Like we've been delivering projects this way for a really long time, but yet somehow we really aren't getting a whole lot better at it. Like, why is that exactly? So, clearly there's an opportunity there still to make better use of the processes and the technology we have available to really try to improve the way we run our companies. So.
Well, Vanessa, we've got a few minutes left. Can we work in a few audience questions?
Absolutely. And just as a reminder, even if we aren't able to answer all of your questions here live, we will get back to you. So please go ahead and pop them in that Ask a Question box in the top left corner of your screen. With that, let me go on ahead and ask this question. It comes from Sally, and they're saying, what are the biggest changes in KPI focus that you've seen over the past 4 to 5 months as the economy has shifted?
Yeah, I mean, I can take that one first. I think I touched on it briefly, but clearly profitability matters these days, right? The days of being able to do projects and sort of consider them maybe not loss leaders, but certainly maybe more of a focus on the delivery metrics and some of the qualitative pieces. Well, again, those things all still matter. Nobody in the world today is going to say, I'm going to go start this work and not be profitable with it. And if you are, then I think you need to take a pretty hard look at how you're running your business these days. Unless, again, that's the model and the structure of how your delivery organization fits in. But that shift has been pretty immediate, I would say, with the way the economy has turned over the past few months. And I don't know, John, if you have any sort of other perspective to that based on the members you talk to, but.
John, I think you're on mute.
Well, I think I'm a technology analyst, not an industry economic analyst, so I'll just leave that to you.
Fair enough. All right, that's fine.
Let me go ahead and squeeze in one last question before we close. This one comes from Max, and they're asking, what are the differences between SaaS organizations and traditional ESOs or PSOs?
Yeah, there's I see a couple other questions along the same vein there, and it's kind of it touches on a few of the things we've covered there today. Certainly, I think we just talked about margins, a good example. While that metric might be important to both sorts of organizations, at a top level, it may be okay to take a hit on profitability for the sake of selling software. Like a lot of software companies are probably in that boat where, yes, you don't want to have a wildly unprofitable services business because you ultimately are there maybe to provide different goals from an organizational standpoint. But so the 50% metric that we were talking about at the top, most software companies would die to have their PS organizations be at 50% gross margins. But for a kind of pure consulting firm, that number, as we said, might actually feel low. And then again, that's all going to be different, as John was saying, based on your peer group and the like. But I think that the scale that you had there at the beginning of the quantitative, qualitative, I would say the qualitative tips a bit more for embedded companies as a really broad brush statement, and the quantitative is definitely where the focus is for more of the pure consultancies, if you will. But again, there's obviously some variations to that depending on the nature of your business and what sort of vertical you work in.
Okay. Well, with that, unfortunately, we have come to the conclusion of today's webinar. Like I said before, I know we've got some unanswered questions, but we haven't forgotten about you. We will follow up. So a few more reminders before we sign off for today. There will be an exit survey at the end. Please take a few minutes to provide your feedback on the content and your experience by filling out that brief survey, and a link to the recorded version of today's webinar will be sent out within the next 24 hours. I'd now like to take this time to thank our presenters, John and Uriah, for delivering an outstanding session, and thank you to everyone for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us for today's live webinar, How to Crush Your KPIs and Deliver Consistent Results, brought to you by Technology and Services Industry Association and sponsored by Kantata. We look forward to seeing you at our next TSIA webinar. Take care, everyone.